This map is what I have got working so far. I was just messing around with open layers and these Firefly cartography map markers, and I got it to work. But it's just a first pass. It's very rough. I'm not really proud of this. It's not a useful visualization. It's useful in that you can tell that it's a worldwide phenomenon. Here's the first version of this, where the dataset had more points, actually, like around San Francisco, more detailed locations. Yeah, this visualization here pulls in the coronavirus data. So if we take a look at the code, it's just this use data thing that I put together in another point in time. Since I want this to be part of the course, what I'm going to do here is start from scratch. So you can follow along each and every step that it takes to get from 0 to hero. So the first thing is, let's get this URL loaded into a brand new program. So what I'm going to do is, first I'll sign into VizHub. And by the way, anyone following along can do the same. And I'm going to go to create a new visualization based on actually probably loading and parsing CSV data would be a good place to start. Yeah, so I'm going to fork this so I don't mess up the original, which I have often done. Fork that. And now let's set our intention of what we're doing here, which is loading and parsing coronavirus data. I would like to use ES6 and everything rather than just straight HTML. So I'm gonna migrate over to a bundle.js approach. Source equals bundle.js, and that file will be created from this new file, index.js. This is a special file name that's picked up by VizHub internally, and it's bundled using rollup. From index.js, bundle.js gets created, and it pulls in all modules from different files, puts them all into one file, so that you can author your code with ES6 modules, which is what we're going to do. So let me just take this content and move it to index.js, and then I'll auto-format with prettier with Alt-P. You can do that in VizHub too. Alt-P, boom, prettify the code. I think it's working. Oh my gosh. Is it really working? That was fast. I'm going to clear out the README because it's outdated. And then I'm going to get that URL. So the question is, here's a URL where it's pulling the CSV file. How do we change this to get the coronavirus data? Well, this URL here goes to some random data set that I've used in the past. And to make it the coronavirus data, we need to go into this GitHub repository. And then, oh, I love how it's updated so frequently nowadays. This is up to date. It's great. So I'm going to go into this directory, CSSE COVID-19 data, and then we've got daily reports versus time series. Now, I don't really know what I'm looking for, but I think I'm looking for the time series. Yeah, see this? There's 3 different files. One for confirmed, one for deaths, and one for recovered. I would like to look at all these eventually, but since deaths now are on the rise, I think we can start with this one about deaths. So I'm going to click on that file. And let's just take a look at the table structure for a minute before we pull it in, because as soon as we pull it in, we're going to have to deal with this table structure. We've got province/state, country/region. So province/state is a more detailed thing than country/region. For example, in Australia, we've got New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland as separate points in this data set. But I don't see one for Australia as a whole. Is it there? See, that's one thing that might be a little weird about this data set. It's like they have the breakdown, but they don't have the sum total for Australia. So we might have to calculate that ourselves. So that's the the first two columns. And then we've got latitude and longitude, which means we can put it on a map, which is sweet. And then we've got dates. Each date is its own column. So if I scroll all the way to the right, you can see the latest date is 3/20/20, and they're just adding another column every day to this. So I'm thinking what we can do is pull down this data and then interrogate the columns to see what is the last column, and just use that, whatever it is, because it's going to change every day. To pull this data in to VizHub, what we need to do is click on this raw link right here. And that takes us to a URL that resolves to the CSV data, and it's not tied to any particular commit. You can get URLs that are tied to a particular commit, and that's what you would want to do if you want it to be stable and never change and never break. To get a URL that resolves to a particular commit, you go to the home page for the repository, click on commits, 424 commits, and then take the most recent one and then say browse files. Right, so see how this here says tree? It's a particular commit. And if you click on raw here, you get this URL that resolves to the CSV file for that particular commit. And you can see it in the URL there that I highlighted. And this means that this link will never break unless they take the repository down. But we can use it here. So I'm going to get rid of this old CSV URL and put a new CSV URL. And it should be there. Let's just do a little exploration. Console.log data. And then in the developer tools, so we have this array of 447 entries. And this is the data set. See that? This is the coronavirus data set. Woohoo! We got it done! All right, so this is like phase 1 complete. Yeah, it's just the same things from the table. Good stuff. And in addition to being an array, data, which is returned from d3.csv, CSV URL .then data. So it's fetching this URL and then giving us the parsed data. And when D3 does this, it not only gives you an array, but it gives you this columns property, which is an array of the columns. So check this out. Here's what we can do. We can isolate the most recent date of this data by getting, at index 62 of the columns array. So data.columns at index 62 is going to be 320. And so this will work, but if a new day is added, if we just hard code 62, it's just going to give us this day forever. So what we want to do is take the last entry. So how do we take the last entry of an array? We can say data.columns.length. That'll overrun the array, so it gives us undefined. But if we do data.columns.length -1, then we get the last entry. So the idea is we can use this to sort of select which date that we're looking at. So let me just take this aside as a variable. I'm going to say const latest date column, just so the code sort of is very readable. But coming back to this issue of having the data set tied to a commit, with this particular visualization and this circumstance, I don't think I want it to be tied to a commit, but I just wanted to show you how to do that, if that's what you want, stability. And I'm going to keep this around in case the data set does break or they take it down. I'm going to keep this whole thing commented out, and I'm going to put the URL that's not tied to any specific commit. So I'm commenting out that old one. I'm going to put a new one here that's going to update every day. It's going to update every day. It's going to be so cool. So I'm going to back out from here, and instead of looking at this one commit, I'm going to look at the master branch, raw, and then now this URL, if you access it tomorrow, should have one new column. And so the visualization should automatically update. That's what I want to get at here. So yeah, this old URL that has a commit is not going to update every day, but it's going to be stable. It's not going to break. This new one, which I'm going to paste right now, boom, it's going to update every day, but if they change the name of the file or something, our visualization will break. So just something to be aware of. All right, we have loaded and parsed the coronavirus data set. Imagine that. One last thing just to make this piece complete is I need to update the README to say this program loads and parses the Johns Hopkins coronavirus data set. Yeah, so I'll just link that. All right, we have loaded and parsed the coronavirus data set. All right, so we've loaded and parsed the data set for coronavirus. The next thing I wanted to do is write some code that calculates the sum total number of deaths as of today and just displays that on the screen. So I'm going to start by forking this one here, and then I'll set my intention by changing the title to be summarizing coronavirus data. All right, so we've got this data here, and we've got the latest date column. And then we're constructing this message, which gets rendered on the screen eventually. I don't care about this stuff so much as the number of deaths. So let's sort of scaffold out how we're going to display the message. We'll just write deaths. That can be const. I don't know. I think it had to be let before. And so I want to have ultimately something like a death total as a number. And I'm just going to put in 10,000 as a placeholder because I know it crossed 10,000 yesterday. And then we can just say as our message, death total plus space deaths total. Oh, and this needs to be quoted. Yeah. Okay, it says 1,000 deaths. Total goes off the screen. We'll just keep it like this, 10,000 deaths. All right, that's how we can display our message. How do we calculate the sum total? Let's take a look at data. Console.log data, and because the data set does not contain overviews for countries, like for example the US, it only contains rows for US states. It does not contain a summary row for the entire United States, and same thing for Australia and probably some other places. So that means that we should be able to just sum up the values in all the rows to calculate the sum total global number of deaths. So let's try that. When I say console.log data, we get this array, and I want to sum over that array. But first we have to map over that array to get all the numbers to sum up. So we can say data.map using the built-in array.map that takes a function that takes as input one row. I'll call it D. And we can return D at latest date column. And that worked. We've got these numbers that are the number of deaths for each and every country for the most recent date. But they're strings, not numbers. To parse these into numbers, we just can add unary plus right here. And boom, we've got the numbers. Now we need to sum up all of these numbers. For this sort of thing, I like to just figure out how to do it in the console and then put it into the code. So let's say we have an array of numbers 1, 2, 3. That should sum up to 6. The way I would do the summation is to use reduce. And this is something that's built into JavaScript. It's kind of like map. Array.reduce takes as input a reducer function. And that function takes as input the accumulator and the current value. The current value is the value in the array, the number. And the accumulator is what got returned from the previous invocation of the reducer. And it also takes as input, let me see, array.reduce. It also takes as input the initial value of the accumulator. And so to implement sum using array.reduce, the initial value will be 0, and the accumulator will just be this same one here that just, adds two numbers together. So I think I'll just grab this code from here. Looks like exactly what we need. Back in my console, I can just use this and have as the second argument 0, just to make sure that we initialize our accumulator. Okay, so that computed the sum. See that? Pretty cool. And what we could even do is define this as sum. And then we can say array.reduce and pass in sum. That'll do the same thing. Okay, so I'm going to take this code and use it inside of our program. All right, so let's define sum right here. It's just that copy-pasted reducer function from the MDN documentation. And we can just apply that to this array of numbers right here by just appending a .reduce. Sum will be the first argument, and 0 will be the second argument. And that should be our death total. So if I just put that there as the death total, it appears to have worked. See that? 11299 deaths. And let's see how that compares to the Johns Hopkins version, because that's how we would know if it's correct or not. Okay, so in the Johns Hopkins version, it says total deaths 11906, and then in our thing it says 11299. Huh. What if I go back to the day before that? Huh. Okay, well this is concerning, because these should match. These should match up. I don't know, maybe they have slightly more up-to-date data than we do. It says last updated 3/21, but our most recent date is console.log latest date column is 3/20. 3/20. So it looks like they have not yet updated their CSV file here. Okay, but hopefully when they do, it'll be matching up to what they have. I think this is the reason why they don't match. But that's all right. All right, we've got it. We've done it. We have summed up the number of deaths. Now I just want to tweak the presentation of this so that it's something that I could show someone. One thing I want to do is fix the number formatting, like add a comma in there. And then also, I think the program should display, as of which date. So let me focus on that piece first. If I just add as of with a new line, yeah, now we can as of, and then I can just put the latest date column. Okay, great. And now I just want to format this number, and we can do that with D3 format. So let's import format from D3, and I believe we can just define a formatter. I'll call it comma formatter as D3 format and pass in just a comma. Pretty sure that's how it works. And then we can pass a number into this function and it will return us a formatted string. And so we should say formatter of death total, and there we have it. And I'll just prettify this. All right, and this could be actually a little bit bigger. I'll make the font size 8 or 9 EM, maybe 8.5. And I just feel like making it not exactly black for some reason. So we can set the color to be black and then change it here with this color picker, and it updates in real time. A super cool trick. Oh, my face is in the way. Sorry about that. So yeah, let's make it red because it's dire. All right, and then I'll just take this, I'll just copy this color into our styles here, and we can say color is that, and boom. All right, very good. So there are 11,299 deaths as of yesterday, not today. But this is pretty much where I wanted to get to. All right, so we have sort of a jumping off point. We've got the data in, we're summarizing the data, and from here we can break it down further. So this is where we got to last time. 11,299 deaths as of 3/20/2020. This is the most recent number of a series of numbers dating back to, well, let's find out. Check this out. If we just do console.log data.columns, what do we see? 63 points. So we've got 63 data points in this time series. And they are, oh, well, actually, they just start at 122. So it's around 60 or 59 or something. But going back to January 22nd, we have data that we can show in this line chart, which we're about to make. I was thinking the best way to show all of these numbers is a line chart, because yeah, this is just the latest number. And you know what I wanted to do? Let me try this. So now I wanted to share this idea that I had for this line chart, because you know, just yesterday they announced that it had crossed 10,000, and in my mind I'm like, wow, that's a milestone that you could represent very clearly in a data visualization. So here's my idea. We show a line chart with the number of cases, which probably looks like that, and then we have a line, and that line means 10,000. And we should have dates. You know, these are specific dates that we should show in the visualization, and we should probably show now as well, which is always shifting, but we could show it. So this is the idea that I had for the visualization to make, and I think we can make it. The first thing to do is draw this line. So I'm going to focus on just getting this line to work, and then we'll take it from there. Now that we've got this starting point for a line chart, we need to make it into a line chart based on what we've got. And let's just review quickly what we've got. We are loading the live data. We are figuring out what the latest date is in the data, and then summing up the death total just for that latest date column. And then we're displaying this message that shows blah, blah, blah. So where should we go from here if we want it to be a line chart? I think what I would like to do is set up the React infrastructure and do this whole thing based on that. So I think I'll just go ahead and actually fork this one and work backwards, because this has all the React infrastructure that I want in place to be making this line. And here, in this new fork, I'm going to change the title of this one to set our intention to say this will be the coronavirus line chart. So what have we got here? We're pulling in React and we're pulling in D3. So we have all of that at our disposal, and this program makes a face. So I'm just going to totally gut this program And instead of making a bunch of faces, I'm going to make a line chart. And so conceptually, I want to have a line chart component, and I want to pass in the data as data. And I think the app should be responsible for orchestrating everything, which means wait for the data to load, and then once the data is loaded, show the line chart. And we could have some intermediate data loading phase too, say like loading until the data is loaded, but it's not strictly required. So anyway, let me just put placeholders for data. This is going to be an array of objects. And also a line chart. Const line chart. It's going to be a React component. And for now, let's just return an SVG. Nothing more than that for now. And our app needs to return this line chart. And we got to close out these curly braces. So now this is our complete program, and I just want to remove some of the leftover things from before, like face.js. I'm going to delete face.js and facecontainer.js, delete that. I'm going to delete the eyes, delete the background circle, and delete mouth. So all we're left with is an out-of-date README, which is, I'm going to also delete that stuff, and a main program that just generates an SVG. And we've got some width and height left over, but we're going to need to know what the width and height is anyway. The way that I like to do this is to actually measure the browser window. And so that way, if you resize the browser window and refresh the page, it would get the latest coordinates or get the latest dimensions. In VizHub, the size is static. But just I like to write code such that if you were to export it out of VizHub and run it, you could resize the browser and refresh, and it would do the right thing. So the width can be, I believe it's document.body.client width. Let me just console.log width to see if it's the right thing. Oh, it got some errors. Uh-oh. Red alert! Face does not exist. Okay, that's fine. We can just delete that import. Hey, 960! Sweet. That's correct. So document.body.clientWidth returns 960 because that's just what VizHub uses for the width. And we can do the same thing for height. So I'm just going to replace width by height and width by height. Looks like we got a syntax error. Oh, height is defined twice. Hey, where's my Vim mode? So Alt-V, by the way, turns on Vim mode in VizHub, which I like to use. Feel more productive. Okay, so height is defined twice. That's what's going on.
Okay, then when you are using line chart component, you are giving it data.
Yeah, that's right.
So where it's not defined there, it doesn't need to be?
Well, yeah, that's a great point. It's still, this is how I'm sort of sketching it out. All the connections are not there yet. But one thing we're going to have to add is unpacking the prop data in the line chart component and doing something with it.
I'm so confused.
Yeah, but right now, data is just an empty array. And so when I add the CSV data to this app, that's when I'll propagate data through this line chart component. But I feel like we're not quite there yet because we need to size the SVG based on the browser window. Yeah, so this SVG and this array is something that's left over from earlier. I just want to get to a clean slate. An SVG gets a default size. So for example, if we were to style SVG to say the background color is red, see we get this little square? And that's because the SVG has a default width and height. And if we were to start working without doing this first, our lines and everything would be like just not in the right spot. Or they would be cut off because the SVG doesn't have width and height. So that's why we need to give a width equals width and height equals height to our SVG element. Something is weird here. It should be a full screen red thing, but I'm not seeing that. Is there a typo or something? No errors. So I'm going to try to figure out if the SVG element is the right size or not by inspecting the elements. Oh, height is 0. Why is height 0? Document.body.client height must be 0. So if I just console.log height, we get 0. Okay, this is the problem. We got to do a little bit of digging here to figure out, JavaScript height of browser window. There might be some. Oh yeah, I remember now. It's window.innerWidth and inner height. What was I thinking? Document.body. Well, I guess it works too, but that's what it should be. So window.innerWidth and window.innerHeight. Okay, there we go. So now we are where we should be with respect to getting an SVG to fill up the screen. Now let's bring in that data that we had from the other program. Summarizing coronavirus data. What I'm going to do is just copy paste some stuff from here to there. But first, let's strategize. How do we want to develop this data fetching logic? Should it be its own component? Should it be its own hook? I think it should be its own hook. So let's set up that infrastructure right here, and then we can move it to a separate file later. But let's make a new hook called useData. And this is...
What is a hook?
Yeah, what is a hook? That's a great question. So what is a hook anyway? If you do a Google search for React hooks, you see this example here. It says, hooks are a new addition to React 16.8. They let you use state and other React features without writing a class. And when they introduced hooks, this is when I really got into React. Before that, the classes sort of turned me off from it. But, after these hooks, it's like, it's such a beautiful way to write code and organize your state and your logic and everything. And it just serves all my purposes very well. And so this is why I think it's a good idea to use React hooks nowadays. Here's an example of state. Use state, which we are going to use to keep track of our data. When you use the React hook called useState, it sets up a local state within that component. And the app, in our case, is the top-level component. And that app is going to keep track of this state called data, where when the page first loads, data, it will be undefined or null or whatever we want. I'm thinking just undefined. So if you don't pass anything into useState, the default value will be undefined. And then we can use the useEffect hook to fetch the data and then set the state to be the newly fetched data. And so these examples here can serve as sort of a boilerplate for setting up our data fetching in React. And this is just how you would do it if you're developing a React application. You want to componentize, separate everything, separate the concerns as much as you can. So if you could separate the concern of loading the data into a separate module, that would be great. And then you can write the rest of your app, the line chart, without having to add checks for, if data is null, which I see all the time, in older examples. But this is sort of the direction we're going with React hooks. So let's make a hook that loads in the coronavirus data. I started setting up this. It's just a function. And React hooks are just functions as well. It's just that they need to be invoked inside of a React component in order to work. So const data equals array. Instead of that, I'm going to say const data equals useData. And it has to be called as a function, because inside this useData function, we're going to use some other React hooks like state, useState, and useEffect. So let's just review the React documentation for useState. Introducing hooks, this is where there's an example of useState. It looks like this. When you call useState, the first argument you pass in is the initial value of the state. So count, in this case, is going to start off at 0. And then setCount is going to be a function that sets the new value for that state. And when that happens, the component is re-rendered meaning this function gets invoked again when the state changes. So then the next time around, count is going to be updated to whatever you pass into setCount, and that's what's going to show up right here. So that's useState in a nutshell. I'm going to start by copying this example code and then pasting it in our code right here. And instead of count, I'm going to have this be data. Data and set data. And just some of the technical details here. useState returns an array with 2 elements. That's why we can use this ES6 destructuring syntax with these brackets to destructure this array that has 2 elements in it. And the reason why the React developers did it this way is so that you can pick your own names for these. So it could be anything. You know, they had count, we have data, but the convention is that the current value is the first one, and then the setter function for that value is the second one. And the naming convention is set, you know, camel case with whatever the name is that you're dealing with. And then this function is going to return data. It doesn't need to return set data because the app is never going to set the data. The data is going to be set from fetching the CSV file. And that's where useEffect comes in. Let's review the React documentation for useEffect. It says here the effect hook lets you perform side effects in function components. So here's an example. We invoke useEffect and pass in a function. And that function will be invoked. This is something it took me a long time to learn with React, but it's super useful. It will be invoked after the DOM elements are rendered on the page. So that's how you can eventually hook into those DOM elements and do the D3 integration that lets you use like the D3 transitions and the D3 axes. In our case, after the component renders the first time, we want to fetch that CSV data. So I'm going to copy this example code into our useData hook. Oh, and we need to import these things. useState, useEffect from React. And this stuff is left over from the example, so I'm going to delete it. And check this out. We can invoke setData. So if I invoke setData with, say, an array that has number 1 in it, check this out. In our app, if we say console.log data, what do we see? Oh no, it looks like we've got like an infinite loop situation. That's weird. And you know why that is? It's because we left out the second argument to useEffect, which is the array of dependencies. See, if you leave that out, the effect gets run every time the component renders. So, and calling setData causes it to re-render, so it's in this rendering loop, and it can't get out. So that's why we need to add the second argument of an empty array. See, what happens now is that the first time this runs, 0 gets output, which is the initial value for data. And then the second time this runs, after setState gets called, this is our new value for data. So let's think about what should the default value be. I think the default value should be undefined. So I'm just going to leave out the argument. So now it starts out undefined, and then it gets set to this array. So that's how we can put in place our React hooks for this useData component. The thing that we can do next is integrate that code that we got working already with loading that CSV file of the coronavirus data. Well, actually, now that I think about it, we're probably going to want to put this into a separate file, not so as not to clutter up app.js, because it's already getting kind of long at 30 lines. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to split out useData into a separate module by creating a new file, naming it useData.js, and then cutting this definition and pasting it into useData, and then exporting useData. Now, over in index.js, we can import that. Import useData from /useData. And there's bound to be some errors because we need to pull over the imports. So here we're importing a bunch of stuff from React. We have to import that over here as well. Yeah, all we need is use state and use effect. And check it out, it's working. It's working. All right, so now we have a place to sort of put all of our logic related to fetching the data. And also in index.js, we don't need these imports anymore for use state and use effect. All right, let's load the CSV data. I'm going to copy CSV URL from this example that we have working. And then I'm going to go over to use data and paste that definition right here. And I'll put the commented out one too, just in case this viz breaks one day and could be restored by using that URL. And then we're going to need to fetch the CSV file. So in our new hook here, we can import CSV from D3. And then in our hook, we can say CSV URL, just like we had before, and then say .then data. And then this function here can be responsible for invoking setData. And then we just pass in data to setData. And this is a little confusing because these share the same name. So let me just say, like, well, first of all, let me just test that this actually works. I think we're console.logging the data at some point. So at first it's undefined, which is when it's loading. That's to be expected. And then it's this array, which is the same array we saw earlier. Awesome. Now, I think we can simplify this code a little bit because this is just a function that takes as input data and then passes data into setData, which is a little redundant. We could just pass in setData itself like this, and it should still work. Yeah, it still works. Awesome. That's how we can define a React hook that loads in the coronavirus data. Now we are in quite a good position. See, in index.js, we've got useData as its own separate module that's just concerned about loading the data. And then we've got LineChart, which will be concerned about rendering the data. And this I'd like to pull out into a separate file as well. So I'm going to make a new file called linechart.js. And then I'll take this definition, move it into there, and add the export keyword. And then in index.js, import linechart from /linechart. And there's bound to be some broken imports. I think we need React. Ooh, reference error. Width is not defined. Okay, we can deal with that. We just need to take those as input as props. I think that makes sense to do it that way. Although it's just coming, it doesn't really matter. It's just coming from window.innerWidth and innerHeight. But in principle, the top level component should be able to tell that lower down component what its size should be. So I think I'll keep it like this. We just need to pass in width equals width and height equals height. Boom. All right, great. Now we've got our line chart separated in a different module, and it has access to the data. So in line chart itself, this is where we can say console.log data. Great. Now we're up to the task of transforming the data into a format that works well with D3, namely an array of objects, each of which represents a point in time. And that is not how this is set up right now. This is set up right now so that each date is its own column. So let's think about how can we do this. I think the line chart component should be able to expect properly formatted data for line chart as data. And so the current thing we're passing in for data is not really going to work. And I think in this case, use data could do the transformation in here. So instead of just passing in set data, I'm going to pass in a function that takes as input raw data. I'll call it raw data because it's not the same thing as the data that we're going to be referring to later. And I think really what I want to do is, call set data on a transformed version of the raw data. So I'll make a new function called transform and pass in raw data. I think that's a nice way to separate the concerns. And then we have to define transform, of course. So I think what we want to do is construct a time series data set where each row represents one of those months, or one of those days, sorry. All right, we need to figure out the set of dates first and foremost. So if I say console.log data, or raw data rather, we can see that the columns starting from the fourth column, the column at index 4 in the array, these are the dates, these are the values. So we are left with the task of isolating the dates only and getting rid of these other things. So this is a case where I like to figure it out in the JavaScript console first. We break it down into a very small problem. The problem is this. We have an array. It starts with A and B. And then it has 1, 2, 3. And we want to just get the 1, 2, 3, 4 and get rid of the A and B. How do we do this? I believe there's a thing called array.splice or slice. Let me just see what happens here. Oh yeah, slice of 1, slice of 2. See that? This is how we get rid of the first couple elements of an array. Great. And that was rawdata.columns. So we got rawdata.columns. Well, let me just console.log this first, and then assign it to a variable. We can say rawdata.columns.slice, let's say 2. And that still gives us lat and long. So if we say .slice of 3, that should only give us long. See that? Just long. And so now if we give it 4, boom, we have isolated the dates. So this one I'm going to assign to a variable called dates. And what we want to do is compute the sum for each and every date and then return that data set. So we can do dates. So what we want to do is say return dates.map, function that takes as input a date. And we're going to want to return an object that just, let's keep it simple. Let's keep the date and the number of deaths, which I'll call deaths. And the deaths is going to be the sum. This is where we need to bring in the sum that we had working earlier. So we used array.reduce. And so I'm going to take this sum function, paste it here, so we have it available. And then I'm going to take this whole definition of death total. I'll return that as part of the object, the new rows. Looks like we got an error here. Data is not defined. That makes sense. We have to use raw data instead. And instead of using the latest date column, we use date. Oh, we got a reference error. Deaths total is not defined. Okay, it's just a mismatch of the names. I think this should be working now. If we just do console.log data, we see an array of objects where each one has a date and a death total. All right, this is it. This is how it should be. Except that the dates should actually be dates, as in JavaScript Data Objects. So I think the next thing I need to do here is parse these dates into JavaScript Data Objects. And we can do that with the help of D3 parse time, I believe. It might be in D3 time format. Parse. Yeah, there we go. Using D3 time format, we can create a parser for a certain date structure. And then we can use time parse to parse strings into JavaScript data objects. So the question is, how do we represent this format that we're using? So Zan Armstrong has this amazing example where she shows you all the different examples of date formats that you can use with D3 format time or parse time. And I'm pretty sure this is the one that we need, except for it's not 1986, it would just be 86. But I think that is just a lowercase y. Yeah, so this is how we need to do it. Something like this, but with the lowercase y. So let's try that. Back in our code, we can define the date format. And this is going to be the string, just taken from that example. But instead of an uppercase y, which would give us 2020, 2020, we just want 20, so that would be a lowercase y. And then with D3 time format, we can pass that into time parse. And by the way, what we're dealing with is called a specifier. So I think I should clarify that in the code. So instead of date format, this is going to be date specifier. And then we can import from D3, I think it was time parse. Yeah, time parse. And then we can define something called parse time, which is kind of funny inversion of time parse. You know what? I think I'll call it parse date equals time parse, and we pass in the date specifier, just like that. And I don't think we really need that variable. Okay, so now the date of the returned object can actually be parse date of the original date. And now that we have JavaScript dates and dates that are strings, this naming is confusing. So I'm going to update this to be, instead of dates, let's call it days, because they really represent days. And this could be parse day also. Yeah, this is looking better. Parse day, and we pass in day. And we got to use day here as well. All right, let's see what we've got. Hey, look at that. It works. We've got dates that are JavaScript dates that look correct, and death total numbers. All right, very good. I can clean this up just a little bit. Death total could be that inlined. Then we can get rid of the explicit return and just use these parentheses here. All right, now we're in a position where we can start making our line chart. I'm just going to clean things up and get rid of this console.log data here, so we have sort of a blank slate. And then in linechart.js, this is where we can start creating our D3 scales. Oh, it's called Untitled. Oh, interesting. You should have caught this title. Getting back to this sketch idea, we're going to need an x-axis and a y-axis. That means we're going to need an x scale and a y scale. The x scale is going to go from left to right, and it's going to represent our time, our dates. So let's create x scale. It's going to be a time scale, which behaves similarly to a linear scale in D3, which is just a linear mapping, but with dates. So we need to import this from D3, import scale time from D3. And with scales, you've got the domain and the range. The domain is the data values, the dates in our case, and the range is the pixel coordinates, which is going to vary between 0 and width because it's x. So we can define that like this. The domain of our time scale is going to be, well, this is where we need to pass in an array with two elements, the minimum and the maximum values. And we need to compute the minimum and maximum values over our dates. So we can use min and max from D3. And the way that we compute the min is we can say min, we pass in the data as the first argument, and the second argument to min is a function that takes as input one row and returns the value that it's supposed to take the minimum of, which in our case is date. And so I can say d.date like that. And same thing for max. Oh, and there's some error. Cannot read property length of undefined. Red alert. Okay, we got to back up here and take a look at what's going wrong. I think what's going wrong is we're passing data into line chart even when it's undefined. So let me just add a little guard, so to speak. It says if there is some data, return the line chart. Otherwise, return null. And this is the ternary operator. But if you haven't seen this syntax, it's the ternary operator, and it says if data is defined as something, if it's truthy, which it's not at first because at first it's undefined, if it is truthy, make the line chart and pass the data into it. And this is how inside the line chart we can be guaranteed that the data is defined. We add the guard outside of the component. But if data is not defined, we just return null. This is where we could return like a loading screen if we wanted to. I'll just make a little div that says loading ... just as a placeholder. Okay, so now that error is gone and we should have a defined domain for xscale. Let's see. Let's say console.log xscale.domain. And if you call domain as a function like this with no arguments, it just returns the domain. And so this is what it returned, and that looks correct, I think. Yeah, the data set goes from January 22nd, 2020 to March 20th, 2020. Yep, that's right. Sweet, we've defined our xscale domain. Now, let's define our xscale range. The range is going to be, again, an array of two values, the min and the max. In this case, it's going to be the pixel coordinates. And I want it to go from left to right across the screen. So the minimum value of the range will be 0, and the max will be width. And by the way, before we move on, I want to point out that you don't need min and max. You can use extent instead, and that will give you that array of two elements. So we can just call extent like this, and we need to import extent from D3, and it still seems to be working correctly. Great. Now let's define our y-scale. The y-scale is going to be the total number of deaths. And intuitively, I think this should start at 0, even if 0 is not the first value that occurs in the data set. So let's make y-scale. Let's start using a linear scale and see how it turns out. I know this data set, a log scale is better, but let's just try it with linear scale and see how it looks, and then maybe change it later to a log scale. So we create a new instance of scale linear, which we need to import from D3. We set the domain to be the extent across the data for D dot, what was it? What do we call it? Deaths total. There it is. Deaths total from each of those rows. So we can say D dot deaths total. But like I was saying, I think it really should have a 0 baseline. I don't know why I feel that so strongly. But the way it is here, it's not going to have a 0 baseline. So that's why we need to use max instead of extent, and then have the first element be 0 and the second element be max. Yeah, I'm going to do it like this. And I think max we need to import. And then the range of the y-scale, the minimum value should be at the bottom of the screen. And the y coordinate system is sort of counterintuitive. Y is 0. A 0 value of y is at the top of the screen, not the bottom. And then a height value of y is at the bottom of the screen. So that's why the range should start at height as the first one and 0 as the second one. Yeah, that's why it's flipped as compared to x. So let's do some proofing and just check if we got this right. Console.log yscale.domain. That looks correct, starting at 0, going up to 11,000 deaths. All right, I think it's working correctly. Now we need to define our line. I just want to put a line in here based on these scales. So let me take a look at the D3 documentation for making lines. And this is in D3 shape. D3 shape is what lets you make lines. Here's a link here for lines. The line generator produces a spline or polyline, as in a line chart. Okay, perfect. So it looks like we're going to need to import line from D3. So let's add that import here, import line from D3. And then once we have it defined, we can pass the data in to generate an SVG path string. But before that, we need to sort of specify how these accessors work. So we're going to have to specify the x and y accessor functions for this line generator. And the default is this. It returns d at index 0. So let's define our own line generator. I'll call it line generator because we already have something called line, which is imported from D3. So we need to tell this line how to project in x and y. And so I think it needs to be actually defined inside of our line chart after the scales are defined, because the x accessor is going to be a function that takes as input a row d and returns the x scale of the x value of d. And x value, I'd like to pull this out as x value. I'll define that out here. And then same thing for y. I'll just replace with the super duper vim commands that are working in VizHub now. Woohoo! I'll replace all x's with y's. Boom. But anyway, we can define y value now as well. And that would be a function that returns the death total. This one here. Okay, we got an error. Oh yeah, this is going to be y value. So now I think everything is set up properly so that the lines should generate. And all we need to do now is put inside of our SVG a path element. So instead of having this being a self-closing JSX tag, I can add a closing tag, and inside the SVG we can put a path. This is how you make shapes and lines and stuff in SVG. You need to use a path element. And then the D attribute of this path element is going to be, and this is where it all comes together, line generator of data. Boom! We got something to show up on the screen. Woohoo! Oh man, look at that. That's something. That is something. Let me fix the fill situation. Yeah, we can just do with some CSS. Or we could do it in the JavaScript. It doesn't matter. I'll just say the line. I'll just do it with CSS. I'll say that the line has a stroke of none. Or no, sorry, a fill of none. Oh, sorry, this should be path. Path has a fill of none. Boom, okay, there we go. And the stroke is what we want to add. The stroke should be black. Oh, I'm in CSS, so I shouldn't quote things. Okay, there we go. There we go. I don't like this red background. It was just a test from earlier. Okay, that's pretty cool. We can set the stroke width as well to be, let's say, 20 pixels. That's going to be extreme. Well, not too bad. Not too extreme. All right, we have created this very basic line chart of coronavirus data. All right, we've created a basic line chart for the coronavirus data. And it's pretty basic, but it shows the data. And so now we've got places to go and things to do, like maybe add in margins and axes and add that line for 10,000 and add that little line for right now. But I think that's enough for now.